So I'm going to use my mild suffering to my advantage by telling you that I have a favor to ask all of you. It's a weird favor, but if you do it, I will feel better. So now you have to. So without moving them, without doing anything weird, just seated as you are, can you raise your hand if you have uncomfortable toes? And if you're confused, then what I mean is this. This is a picture of toes. So I can't see all of you, obviously. So if you are raising your hand, if you do have uncomfortable toes, I hope you feel better soon. You can just not participate in this. But generally, if nothing is wrong, we don't notice our toes. They don't call much attention to themselves. So could you do me a second favor? And I promise no harm will come to you. But if you could really pay attention to your left big toe. For reference, that's there. Or depending on how you're seated, if your legs are crossed, it might be on the side, which is sneaky. It really helps if you look at the toe. Please don't take off your shoes. Just stare at where you know the toe is. Don't move your toes. Just concentrate really hard on that big one. Concentrate really hard for me. Just notice how it feels without moving it. Can your toe feel the sock you're wearing? How's your toe joint doing? Are there any aches in that big toe? How heavy does the toe feel? Can you feel the toenail? Now keep concentrating and imagine really hard. Imagine that your toe is not comfortable. Imagine it's annoying you. What does that feel like? Keep staring, keep concentrating. And now, try to move just that big toe. And for some of you, it might be harder than normal to move it. Oh, so fascinating, so interesting. Please raise your hand if you now can feel your toe. Thank you. Your toe should feel normal again momentarily. For years, the placebo effect was considered a sign of failure, writes Harvard Health Publishing. The placebo effect was considered to be just background radiation noise involved with medical trials. A drug trial had to show efficacy beyond this meaningless noise to be deemed effective. And the nocebo effect is, of course, the opposite, a negative background effect. But more recently, experts have concluded that reacting to a placebo is not proof that a certain treatment doesn't work, but rather that another additional non-pharmacological mechanism may be present. In other words, there's something going on here that's real enough to pay attention to on its own. A few years ago, researchers dug into how the placebo effect affects even successful drug outcomes. So they studied about 450 migraine attacks. In response to a migraine, some study participants got an envelope labeled Maxalt, which is a painkiller used to treat migraines. And inside that envelope was a dose of Maxalt. And the patient took the dose of Maxalt and had a 62% reduction in pain. Great. But sometimes participants were given Maxalt, but it came out of an envelope labeled placebo. And patients experienced 30% of pain relief. Half of the pain relief comes from the imagination that the drug will provide pain relief. What? Can that be right? So to double check, researchers also gave some migraine havers an envelope labeled Maxalt, but inside, of course, was a placebo. And the pain relief? 38%. One of the researchers' conclusions is a call to investigate the so-called honest placebo across a range of treatments. If a person's imagination of what an outcome could be has such a large impact on the human experience, then willfully, deliberately harnessing this imagination is a path worth investigating to them. Not instead of other medical treatment, but alongside. When I told you your toe was uncomfortable, and if you were actively participating, it probably became slightly uncomfortable. Did you imagine your toe was uncomfortable, or was it actually uncomfortable? Or is there not a difference? We have to contend with the uncomfortable reality that imagination has more power than we think. We need to think of imagination not as something to dismiss, nor as a replacement for other action, but a respected consideration in its own right. Okay, so I'll start my talk now. Again, hi, I'm Trevin. I'm here to talk about how great climate games are made. And hopefully this talk is already not what you imagined it would be. I am the director at Direlark, a game design for change studio in Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm also a senior fellow at the Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. And with Archrock's help, we've pooled our efforts to do a bit of research into how games about the climate and sustainability are made. So my team and I interviewed the leaders of 15 climate game projects who are located across 9 countries and 5 continents, working on projects across 12 different topics and targeting a wide variety of release platforms. We really wanted to learn What do these teams intend to do? How are they reaching their intent? What's working well for them? What are they struggling with? What support do they need? What lessons might they have for other projects that might want to find both an audience and market success, while also grappling with real pressing environmental contexts? We found a lot of things, and the full findings will be published early next year. I promise I'm writing as fast as I can. But for today, here's one big thing we found. Great climate games rise to the challenge of effectively navigating between what's real and what's imagined. They have to deal head on with the notion that the line between what's real and what's fantasy is not a clear boundary, but rather a tangled mess, as you already know. As game developers, we often think about the player fantasy. For example, does this game let me experience what I imagine being Spider-Man would feel like? We make decisions made through that lens. What helps reinforce this fantasy? But the story doesn't help here, because the story doesn't stop here, because as great games draw us in, they help us reimagine what this fantasy is like. And these great games help this fantasy feel real, and they leave lasting impressions on us because these experiences are more specifically real than we had imagined, or maybe even different than we had imagined. Players come for the fantasy they imagine they want, but often stay for the specificity of the reality of their experience, which in turn transforms their imagination again. So now we have this loop drawn around this messy dividing line. What feels imagined and what feels real are influencing each other in the minds of the developers and the audiences. And to be really clear, projects cannot escape this. Nearly every single development decision in game development impacts how a project intersects with this mess. What decisions can players make? What systems do you ask them to think about? What environments do you ask them to navigate? How are you presenting these environments? There isn't a clean right or wrong choice to any of these questions. Whether you're making a game to help players laugh with delight, or connect with you emotionally, or think critically, or build community, or whatever, decisions have to be made. Games are always abstractions of the rest of the world, filtered through the developers and the players. In games that are about real contexts, this work collides with all of the players' imagination of what the real context is like. And I want to stress what I just said. Games about real context do not only have to deal with what the real context is, they have to deal with what the players imagine the real context to be. The intent behind 2013's SimCity was certainly not to be a game about climate or environmental sustainability, so I'm not bringing it up today to critique it, but it illustrates something really well, because this city builder was publicly described as a game that lets you really recreate American urban centers. And famously, this game about cities has no parking lots. In an interview about the design philosophy of the project, the design lead said, "We were originally going to model real cities, but we quickly realized there are way too many parking lots in the real world, and that our game was going to be really boring if it was proportional in terms of parking lots. We had to do the best we could do and still make the game look attractive." This is a choice. Again, I'm not critiquing the fact that a choice was made. I just want to highlight that this was not just a choice, that this bit of reality could be abstracted out of existence, but also a choice about what an attractive city looks like in response to reality being different than what the developers had imagined it to be. And I'd be willing to bet that with today's audience, many of you imagine attractive urban areas differently than these developers might have. It is very American to imagine urban life as the individual ability to drive our cars to the doorsteps of any building we want to enter. And it is very American to forget that this does not work at scale. And this game wasn't interested in disrupting this fantasy, which is fine. But what if it had been? What if parking lots had been presented as they really do in Arlington, Texas? And so parking lots in the game would have to cover 42% of the playable area if you decide to build a city where cars are the only way to get around. What if you presented pedestrian-friendly planning as more aesthetically desirable? Well, then perhaps what players imagine feels different than what they expected. And this difference is surprising, and as they keep playing with the game systems, they develop a new imagination for how things work. Here's how one of the climate game leads we interviewed expressed this to us. They said games have the unique ability to get people thinking about interesting issues. I think with even party games, even if you're able to do it well. It was a big goal for us with our game to do exactly that. Create an environment where people are exploring interesting topics and sort of pushing themselves a little bit intellectually without knowing they are. And so that's always a big goal of the games we make. It's just sort of sneaking in that level of thoughtfulness. This brings me to the second part of my talk, which is titled, Why Does This Matter? I will tell you why. It has to do with socio-technical imaginaries, which is to say how we collectively imagine our relationship to a technology and how we collectively imagine the future of that relationship directly impacts how we collectively behave. Let me give you examples. So sometimes I will ask people the following questions. Where does energy come from? And what does the ideal future of energy offer? Now you, in this audience, you're very good. You might be thinking about actual power plants and methods of energy generation which connect to you. That's very good of you. But most people don't have that answer ready. The gut reaction answer often is that where does energy come from? It comes from the power outlet, obviously. And that's a fair response. A lot of technological progress and logistical work has been involved in getting Western urban areas to the point where we don't think about this almost ever. If I need electricity, I find an outlet and I'm done. And that shapes my answer to the second question. Very often, again, when you ask Western urban citizens, they'll say something like, well, the ideal future is limitless access to truly sustainable energy. The easier, the better. Think about how much better life would be with sustainable, reliable energy. And when I'm feeling uncritical, this is my honest, imagined ideal future too. And if you feel similarly, that's okay. This is our socio-technical imaginary. And it's an old imaginary, and it's not an accident we share it. This is exactly how dominant renewable energy story has been told for almost a century, with post-war American nuclear energy sold specifically as a solution to end all labor. That was the dominant imaginary and the fantasy desired by population centers. But this has never been the imaginary of communities who actually produce the electricity we're taking for granted. The good society they imagine is one in which domestic resource extraction does not simply produce energy for consumers, but also opportunities for blue-collar people to engage in well-paid work that anchors their sense of self and community. A moral, sustainable energy system for these communities is one that adds labor, not one that makes labor less necessary. This is the imagined future they aim for, the fantasy they want to become a reality, in contrast to the dominant one. This is so important. We will never have an effective, meaningful, sustainable transition as a whole society if we ignore the multitudes of imagined futures out there that are different from each other. We are all going to have to figure out how to reimagine a more complicated, inclusive future, or change will just hit a brick wall when it reaches communities that didn't get to participate in deciding what the best change would be. What then is our path forward? How do we navigate this? More research has answers. They found that design fiction is a useful tool for concretizing spaces where dominant narratives have been weakly nonspecific. It is by telling stories and crafting experiences that lets us specifically and explicitly explore our imagined futures. We get to critique them, refine them, and improve them together. The situated specificity is everything here. Too often we talk about sustainable futures and broad sweeping visions, and broad sweeping optimism does have its place, but we need fully realized scenarios to be able to make our imagined futures better. And when our imagined futures get better, they drive effective action more effectively. We need this loop. And as I covered earlier, game projects can't escape the loop, but when a game team consciously confronts the loop, some really powerful stuff starts to happen. So to use their own words, Daybreak is a cooperative board game about stopping climate change. It presents a hopeful vision of the near future where you get to build the mind-blowing technologies and resilient societies we need to save the planet. The designers have also very helpfully written extensive public design diaries describing their process. This is a game that builds its hopeful fantasy on a grounded foundation of real global systems and a true respect for the complexity of the challenge at hand. So here you can see all of their iterations in order of the game board. This is a time lapse of their game board game development. And with this evolution, you can directly watch the designers navigating that space between what's real and what's imagined. Every board change represents a decision made about what's an abstraction, what gets foregrounded, what gets reframed, what gets centered. How much information is overwhelming paired with how much information you need to not be misleading. And I invite you to watch the whole thing later. When this process is embraced, you get great game design, sure, but you also get great science communication, great critical reflection, and great imaginary co-creation with players. And this is exactly what we need. Built on specifically situated contexts, games can offer new futures worth pursuing and new critical approaches to reaching them. We need more great climate games that force developers and players and societies to co-create better, more resilient imaginaries that lead toward better futures. And we need these games providing experiences from everywhere. Confront the gaps between where we are and where we imagine we want to go. Help your players imagine what is possible and what is useful and what has meaning. Play lets us imagine new futures together, which means play lets us reach those new futures together. If you want to dive further into the world of how this can work, I highly recommend you checking out Anticiplay, who are smartly focused on charting out this space. And they have a lot of good thinking here already. I encourage you to check them out. And I think it's very validating that our own research of climate game development has arrived at similar conclusions. Play lets us navigate this already messy line between what feels real and what we imagine to be possible. Through play, we can disrupt and recreate new relationships between what's real and what's imagined. And this is foundational to how games about climate and sustainability can help bring about change. And if I've done anything today, I hope I've at least planted some seeds for some of you, convinced some of you of some of this. And I hope you remember my points whenever you feel your toes. Thank you.